Hi, this is Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist bookshelf. Let's take another look at Adrian Adams' book. He's a lawyer. In fact, that's the subtitle of his book. It's called Which God is God? And he says which God, that's a small g, is God, capital G. Subtitle, A Lawyer's Look at God and Religion. So one of his chapters I wanted to share with you today is called God's Distinctive Knowledge. And he talks about rules of evidence that lawyers use, and here's what it says. The content of a writing may reveal knowledge that's sufficiently distinctive to support a finding that it was authored by a particular individual who had such knowledge. So it said, whenever an authorship of a document is unclear, what do investigators do? They look for information in the writing that could identify who wrote it. So he gives an example. Maybe somebody sends an anonymous letter threatening to harm the owner of a company, but maybe you could find out who that was. You look at the peculiarities of spelling, maybe abbreviations, punctuation, slang, whatever that would be unique to the author. He says that's the same thing that you find. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned, Adrian Adams. Okay, so in case you hear me say he, you know who I'm talking about. So he says that same technique, remember he's a lawyer, could be applied to religious writings. So he said, you can look for information in each religion's sacred texts to help identify the author. Now he says, of course, religious texts are going to focus especially on spiritual matters, but sometimes they touch on scientific or medical ones. So here comes the crucial part. If the information is accurate, and especially if it flies in the face of whatever was a prevailing belief at the time, that points to divine authorship. But he says if the information seems error-ridden, if it seems tied in too much to whatever was contemporary at the time, that may be human authorship. So he goes through different areas. So let's start with the first one. He says, let's look at the creation of the universe. He says that's a good place to start to identify the author. So he says the scientific community has established that the universe is not infinite and it's not eternal. It exploded into existence. What do they call that? The Big Bang. And it came into existence out of nothing, and it's slowly running down. So now he starts looking at different religious groups. So he starts with the Hindus. He said they have 2 or 3 conflicting creation accounts. In one, there's a golden egg that broke in two. One shell became the sky, the other became the earth, and the yolk was the sun. Okay, here's another version that they have. An unidentified goddess crouched and gave birth to the world. There's even a third version. The gods created the world by dismembering a giant. Now he says, think about that. He says, none of those accounts are compatible with what we know about the universe's beginning. None of them involve God creating the universe out of nothing. It's just a bunch of guesswork influenced by what he calls a polytheistic or pantheistic view of the universe. That indicates to him, and I think it makes sense, that indicates human authorship, not divine revelation. All right, here's another one. Let's look at Buddhism. What does Buddhism say about the creation of the universe? It says it sees the universe as layers of wind circles topped by a lotus flower upon which the Buddha sits. The lotus flower has 1,000 petals, and each of those has 10 billion worlds. So he quotes from a man named Sadhakata. He's an author of what's called Buddhist cosmology. He wrote that description is totally unrelated to what we know about the universe, and he even conceded that the Buddhist cosmology is outdated and its teachings are absurd. And said that it confirms the Buddha, Gautama, asserted that his teachings result from his own beliefs, not divine inspiration. What about Taoism? Well, everything is a balance of contradictions. So said even their creative narrative, creation narrative, that's a contradiction. How? Well, they say that being and non-being create each other. And all things are born of the Tao, yet the Tao does not create them. What? He says that one-line creation account provides no evidence of divine inspiration. Yeah, I'd agree with that. What about the New Age movement? What do they say about the creation? He said, well, there's one Aquarian element that claims that an impersonal, self-organizing dynamic of some kind gave birth to the universe and a lot of gods. And to experience the physical aspects of the universe, these newly formed gods created physical bodies to inhabit, and they called that man. Now, do you see what's going on here? That we are actually gods, we're just not aware of it, so we just need to wake up. So he said, their beauty trap the gods in the bodies they created. And these Aquarians believe that karma is guiding the gods back to full spirituality. So how's that sound? Does that sound like what's going on as far as science says? And he says you have Wiccans. They're divided in what brought the universe into existence. Some believe a mother goddess created herself and then gave birth to the universe. You have the Raelians. They believe the universe is infinite, no beginning, no end. So he said, if you look at all of these New Age ideas, said those accounts are pretty clear that their information did not come from God. They credited other sources like even aliens or nature spirits or long-dead individuals. Now, how about Islam? What do they say regarding the creation of the universe? It really doesn't have a unified description of creation. They have fragments of it all through the Quran. Muhammad says Allah created the universe, but he's got contradictory details. He claims Allah created the universe in 6 periods, but elsewhere says it was 8 days. He was also pretty inconsistent about the creation of the human creature. He makes man the product of dust in one place, earth someplace else, burned clay, or a drop of thick fluid, or nothing, or water, or a blood clot. He said all these discrepancies indicate to him human authorship, not divine inspiration. But he said, look at Judaism. The Bible's creation account is different. It was written by Moses, and he departed dramatically from what was the thought of the time. He was raised in an Egyptian royal family. He would have been taught their belief system. So we should expect some kind of Egyptian creation account in the Bible. For example, he says in one story, you have the Egyptian god Ra. He discharged the god Shu from himself and spat out the goddess Tefnut. The sun is the eye of the god Nu, who was brought up from the watery abyss by his children. Humans emerged from the tears of Khepera. So he said, instead of repeating these stories, Moses presented a completely different version of how the universe was created. He didn't describe a pre-existing watery abyss or gods getting their feet wet or plucking out their eyes or giving birth to the sun. He didn't say the universe was eternal. Instead, here's what he says. Look at Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. He quotes from Robert Jastrow, and he says he was a physicist, astrophysicist, and founder of the NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He wrote that the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world, that it just broke into existence in a flash of light and energy. Now, what's interesting to me about that, Robert Jastrow, is that he was not a Christian, and yet he concedes. He said, the astronomical evidence ties in very nicely with the biblical view. The author of this book, Adams, says there's a physicist, Gerald Schroeder. Again, he noted the accuracy of the Genesis account. He wrote a book called The Science of God. He says, now this Schroeder, this physicist, wrote that as far back as Aristotle, something like 2,300 years ago, science thought the universe was eternal. And it really wasn't until Einstein changed our view that scientists realized, oh, the Bible was right all along. The universe had a beginning. It emerged out of nothing. No space, time, matter, or energy. Right? It has to be a supernatural cause because nature didn't bring itself into existence. So it came out of nothing in a flash of light. Okay, so that's a look at the account of creation. He says, why don't we take a look at another aspect of science, looking at the death of the universe. So we've been looking at how the universe got started, what's going to happen. He says, well, if you go back to the Hebrew scriptures, and he's going to take us to Psalm and then Isaiah, they both indicate the universe is wearing out. So here's Psalm 102. In the beginning you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. And then Isaiah 51 says this, lift up your eyes to the heavens, look at the earth beneath. The heavens will vanish like smoke, the earth will wear out like a garment. So what a challenge, right? The Hebrew scriptures took on the prevailing belief that the universe was eternal and unchanging. And this is thousands of years before science did discover that, yes, actually the earth is wearing out. All right, let's look at an area of astronomy. So we've heard about the birth and death of the universe. What does astronomy say as far as the Bible's accuracy? Well, the Bible says stars and planets were created objects. They were not gods. So in Genesis 1, God says, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years. What about the number of stars? Well, we can look up roughly and see something like 6,000 to 7,000 stars, but the Bible says stars can't be counted, and they're as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Well, guess what modern astronomy has found as they've looked out deeper and deeper into the heavens? The stars can't be counted, just estimated. He says the current estimate is 200 billion trillion stars. Said that's about 10 times the estimated number of grains of sand on all the beaches of Earth. And so that number is just growing. What about the shape of the Earth? Well, ancient Babylonians thought the world was flat and it floated on water and was surrounded by a wall that supported the sky. What did the Chinese think? Ancient Chinese thought it was an inverted bowl or a square like a chessboard. Greeks were, I guess, divided on the subject. Adams says Homer thought the earth was a disk supported by pillars, with the heavens an inverted hemisphere resting on the rim. Thales of Miletus supposed it was a disk floating on water. Anaximander thought the world was cylindrical and surrounded by balls of fire. So it wasn't really until the 15th and 17th century, as explorers sailed around the world, they finally accepted the idea that the earth was a sphere. And it says 2,000 or 3,000 years before that, the Bible accurately stated the earth was round and suspended over nothing. Okay, let's try some more science here. What about earth sciences? All right, let's take ocean currents. The Bible made accurate statements about the earth's oceans. The book of Psalms talks about paths in the sea, and it said it wasn't until an American naval officer in the 1800s discovered the meaning. He was homesick. He was an American naval officer. He was homesick one day. I had his son read him something from the Bible, and when he got to Psalm 8:8, it said the fish swim in paths of the sea, and he was struck by the possibility maybe the oceans have pathways. So he started traveling the oceans. He started charting their currents. Published his results in 1847. His name was Matthew Maury, Maury, and his charts impacted shipping. His sea lane maps could reduce a trip like from New York to San Francisco by almost 2 months. He was nicknamed Pathfinder of the Seas, and he publicly credited the Bible for his discoveries. All right, what about the ocean floors? We're still looking at earth sciences. The Bible describes ocean floors as having valleys and recesses. Well, people thought it was a real flat, smooth surface, and now they found out using sonar that the bottom of the ocean is rugged. It has mountains and it has plunging canyons. What about rain? Hindu scriptures said rain was caused by gods. They flew around the world in a chariot that was dragging a water bag upside down. What does the Hebrew scriptures say, the Bible? They say rain's a natural cycle in which water is drawn in the air, distilled as rain, and returned to streams that flow to their source without filling the sea. And finally, in the 17th century, there was a scientist, Pierre Perrault. He confirmed that. He showed water evaporates from the oceans, enters the atmosphere, forms clouds, condenses into rain, and then returns again to the Earth's surface. So there's the cycle. What about wind? Hindu scriptures said the wind is, it's attributed to Vayu, the god of winds. But 1868, Edmund Halley connected atmospheric circulation to rising air that was heated by the sun. Well, that aligns with the Bible. The Bible talks about wind patterns. Instead of making winds the capricious acts of gods, the Bible described them as naturally occurring cycles with winds ever returning on their course. Can we take a look at medicine? Okay, it said, we know this. People were totally mystified by causes and cures, and all sorts of terrible things happened to people, and they couldn't figure out how to prevent them. What did Hinduism say? Well, the medical information there is a combination of religious, magical, and empirical practices. Illness was considered punishment by the gods, and karma. And treatment, you had to make the gods happy. You had to drive out demons. What about Buddhism? Well, it adopted the idea of karma, so why study or cure disease? The afflictions were there to punish sin, so tough luck, stick it out. Taoism. Well, it held medicine back in China for thousands of years. It did a lot of harm. They ended up, Taoists developed elixirs, and the catch was they were using all sorts of toxic substances like arsenic, mercury, lead, gold. And they had symptoms of poisoning. And Islam says medical concepts are just about non-existent in the Quran. And then you come to Judaism. It says of 600 plus commandments found in the Bible, over 200 are health-related. So what did Moses talk about? Well, it says the Egyptian doctors that he was part of that society, they had a superficial knowledge of anatomy and physiology and surgical techniques and even dentistry, but the way they treated internal disorders, it was just magic or incantations or superstitions. They thought the disease was the work of demons or spirits of the dead. They came in through your nostrils, your mouth, your ears. So what did they advocate? Spells, incantations, magic amulets. So he had magic to treat scorpion stings or snake bites or eye disease. Magicians routinely cursed and threatened and warned and told the spirits, get out. And gave them orders, you got to leave. But what did Moses do? He abandoned those medical practices when he wrote those health laws. There's a medical historian named Benjamin Gordon. He said the Bible's medical practices were more thorough about hygiene and disease prevention than those of Egypt. And because of those health laws, he said those are medically sound. Israel was spared a lot of the diseases that afflicted Egypt. And that was contrary to what he'd grown up with. And then finally, at the end of the chapter, he talks about what he calls the roots of modern science. And he said, there was a mathematician philosopher named Alfred North Whitehead. And he said, science can't advance unless you believe there's order in nature. Now think about that for a minute. If nature is capricious and things can change all the time, why would you study it? Whatever you study today might not be true tomorrow. So he said, until recently, the study of science in China and India were just about negligible because of the belief that there were capricious gods that controlled events. So what's the point? You got temperamental gods, you just got to make them happy because they change things all the time. And they believed that disease was an illusion or maybe the result of bad karma. So why would you study it? And Taoism said, just abandon the world, empty your minds, yield to the Tao. In other words, don't pay any attention. But what did Hebrew Scripture say? There was a rational God. He created nature. He set it in motion. And that belief encouraged the study of nature to better understand God. And Whitehead said this worldview gave rise to modern science. And he mentions Paul Davies. He's a physicist. Now, Davies is not a Christian. He wrote a book called The Mind of God. And he identified some of history's major scientists who used that idea that there was a rational universe out there that could be studied, and you could use mathematical laws that governed it. And that would be like astronomers, Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler. They came up with the idea of planetary motion. René Descartes, Isaac Newton. Newton, developed laws of motion and gravitation. They actually saw the universe as a magnificent machine constructed by God. Einstein, he thought that searching for God's design was the source of all true science. Wow. So the biblical concept of time encouraged scientific advancement. And he quotes from Richard Morris. He's a theoretical physicist. And he wrote a book called Time's Arrows, Scientific Attitudes Toward Time. He said most ancient civilizations thought time was cyclical, with the same thing just going over and over and over again. So that seemed to be purposeless, right? Looking at the universe. So what's the point of doing science? But that's not what Hebrew Scriptures see time as. Instead of cycles, the Bible teaches time had a beginning and it'll have an ending. And it flows in a straight line with unique historical events. That's a linear view of time. And that had a profound effect on Western thought, and it supported all sorts of social progress as well as technological development. So, as a wrap-up here, he said, so the Hebrew Bible had factual information about cosmology, astronomy, earth sciences, and medicine way before they were confirmed by science. But even its description of a rational God and the linear nature of time promoted a vigorous pursuit of science. So as he wraps up, very end of the chapter, he said, ancient biblical prophets couldn't have known the things that we now know, that the universe had a beginning and is wearing out, that you can't count the stars, that the earth is circular and suspended over nothing, that wind travels in patterns, that water recycles, and ocean floors have valleys and recesses. But the Bible had all of that. And in medicine, the Bible avoided all these errors and misconceptions that were in Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism, and actually promoted medical practices way ahead of their time. And he says such knowledge could only have come from, you ready? One reliable source, the God who put everything in motion. So he said that should give us confidence in the Bible. So that's his chapter about looking at things like science and how does science relate to the views of the Bible and all. So I like that a lot. I thought that was really interesting. So that's Which God is God. Adrian Adams is the author, and he's an attorney, a lawyer, and he was in the Marine Corps, earned a degree in psychology, minored in chemistry and biology, got an MBA from UCLA, a law degree from Southwestern Law School, and he set up his own law firm. This guy is sharp, and it's an easy-to-understand book, and I think you might enjoy reading it. So thanks for listening, and I hope your day is going well. I'll talk to you later.